Welcome to RPG Heroes, a podcast where every other week I speak to a true hero in the realm of role-playing games about their journey, their craft, and their views. As your host, I will focus on one particular aspect of this wonderful hobby for the interview, regale you with stories from my own 25 years of experience with role-playing games, and reflect on the major takeaways from the interview. Join me now on this epic journey and awaken the hero in you. In the first ever episode of RPG Heroes, we delve into our main topic, getting started, with the help of the amazing Hankerin Ferinale, also known as Runehammer, creator of Index Card RPG and the Runehammer channel on YouTube. If you haven't done so already, make sure to check out his videos. They contain real knowledge bombs. Links to his channel and his products are in the show notes. And if you stick with us until the end of the episode, there's also a competition for those of you who are interested in Index Card RPG. Now, for today's topic, getting started. Why is that interesting to talk about when we're looking at role-playing games? Some of you will be new to the hobby. What an exciting time. Others will have some experience already, or maybe even starting a new campaign, a new character, a new role such as Games Master, or writing new content, or even trying a new format or platform to play. Whatever it is, getting started always is a bit of a hurdle, including, for me, starting this podcast. Somehow, though, we tend to manage, don't we? And there's a few things that I would like to talk about when it comes to getting started. And the first thing is getting started with role-playing in general. Now, this is, I think, interesting for people who are about to start their journey into role-playing games, but also very interesting for people who are in a group already, who have been playing for an X amount of months or even years, who are about to receive a new person in their group, or who want to introduce a friend or a family member into the hobby. I remember being introduced to the idea of role-playing games myself. This is some 25 years ago. God, when you say it out loud, it sounds like a long, long time. Anyway, I was in secondary school, third year, I believe, and I was running outside of the school during PE. Not my favorite activity. And a new classmate ran up next to me and asked me a crucial question at that time, which was, have you ever read Lord of the Rings? For me, it was a question that said a lot about his interests, and also, I guess for him, it meant a lot about my interests. And when I said yes, rather emphatically, he replied by saying, okay, cool, have you ever heard of Dungeons and Dragons? I said, the name rings a bell, but not really, no. A few weeks later, we were at the gaming table. He was showing me how to create my first character in 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and there we went. Wow. And it was such a simple act for him to just ask me, hey, in a certain way, if you rephrase it, he asked me, are you interested in fantasy? And if so, are you interested in playing a fantasy role-playing game with me and my friends? And to this day, I'm hugely grateful that he actually did this, that he took that step, and also that he took the trouble to teach me how to play this game. Because back then, there weren't as many resources as there are now that can help you get an idea of how role-playing works, or even see an example of how it is played. And in my country, the Netherlands, it was also not that easy to find a shop that would actually sell books related to role-playing games. A couple of the things that I think he did really well, that Game Master, was, first of all, getting me into the group, introducing me to his friends, and being very open to new players and to inexperienced players. His group was the same. They were all very understanding of the fact that I didn't know the rules yet, or that I had no clue really what D&D was all about. And then he was also very relaxed about getting me to create my first character, because that's quite a step, I think. If you've never played any of these games and you've never participated in a group, and suddenly somebody says, well, let's make you a character, what do you want to be? That's quite a question. And I would really follow his advice, I think, if you're introducing someone to a game, which was he tried to paint me a picture of this fantasy world, kind of like Lord of the Rings, but different. And introduced to me the idea that my character was going to be a person in that world. And he said, well, of all the fantasy stuff that you've read so far, what do you think is really cool? What would you like to be able to do? Who would you like to be? Just doesn't matter what the rules are of the game. Let's forget about that for a second. Let's start with a concept. And yeah, at the time I was very interested in rogues. So I thought, okay, I'd like to be a rogue, a thief, something like that. And off we went. As we played, I got more and more familiar with the rules. He would explain things to me. This is the die you use for this, and this is what you roll when that happens. And like I said, as time went along, the rules became more familiar. I started to actually read the books, buy the books first of all, buy some dice, etc. And that's really the beginning of a long, long story of me getting completely obsessed with role-playing games. So, great introduction. Now, for those of you who want to start now, you're kind of lucky, because this is a golden age for role-playing games, if you ask me, with the internet. You can see or listen to examples of how the game could be played using YouTube and other media, where you can actually get a pretty good idea of how it could be done. Of course, being a little bit careful about what you pick, and also be a bit critical of the fact that a lot of these actual play shows, they are entertainment. It's going to be a little bit different, and sometimes a lot different, from the experience of being at the table. And if you're not as lucky as I am with my friends, or as I was back at the time, what you could always do is just grab a bunch of dice from a store, or even download a dice roller tool for your phone if you can't find the store, or if you don't have the money for the dice, and just start out with a super simple concept. And one of the resources that I would definitely recommend is the YouTube channel of today's guest. So his YouTube channel is called Runehammer. And on that channel, you can find a playlist called Getting Started with Role-Playing, where Hankerin explains what you could do to get started into the idea of, hey, this is role-playing, and this is also a typical mechanic, let's say, for playing these type of games, rolling a die, adding some kind of modifier or not, and comparing results to either a difficulty class or even to each other's results, right? And as with most things that I mention on the podcast, links to this will be provided in the show notes. And like I said, if you're a beginner, take a look at it. At the very least, you're going to learn a thing or two about the basic mechanics of quite a lot of role-playing games that are out there. Now, at some point when you're playing this game, if you have been playing for a while, or if you want to get started but you cannot find a group to join, you might think of starting your own group, or at the very least starting to run your own game as a games master, dungeon master, or whatever it's called. It's a funny thing that I started to notice more and more, is that a lot of different role-playing games look for a unique name for this particular role in the game. I think the word dungeon master is pretty universal, as well as games master or game master. So let's stick with that for the podcast. But believe me, when you open up a couple of these different role-playing game books, you'll find different names for it. Doesn't matter. The role remains largely the same, which is that you're the one who's going to run the game, who's going to educate different rules, probably, who's going to think of a scenario and try and guide the players through this, or at the very least tell them what it is that they see, hear, smell, etc., experience when their characters are in the game. If you want to do this for the very first time, it can feel a little bit daunting, but at the same time, when you think of it as just another different type of role to play in the game, is not all that different. You're still responding to what's happening. You're still using the same rules as you have been as a player, if you decide to stick to the same game. And even if you don't know the rules perfectly, most of the other players are not really going to hold that against you now, are they? I'm sure you didn't with your games master. And just as with starting to play for the very first time, I think the same advice goes for starting to run the game for the first time, which is keep it simple, keep it light, keep it manageable for yourself. So if you're one of those people who's very good at reading rules just once and remembering them, fine, great, use them all. If you're one of those people like me who, for me it takes a little bit longer to learn these things, keep it simple. Use those parts of the rules that are very familiar to you. Perhaps ask one of the more experienced players in your group, if you have them, to help you out with rules questions. And the great thing is most books will also tell you that the games master has this very unique right, which is to say, this is how it's going to go for now, and maybe after the game we can talk about or look in the book, etc., how it should have been done, perhaps. As long as the game is fun, I think that is the most crucial thing to worry about. One great resource for figuring out how to start running your first game is a YouTube channel called WASD20. Sounds a bit complicated until you look at your keyboard and you figure, oh yeah, of course. So this YouTuber has quite a lot of videos about all kinds of role-playing game-related topics. He's also really great at teaching you how to create cool maps for your game, but that's a topic for another podcast. The particular video that I want to refer to, which again you can find in the show notes, is called Running Your First Game, in which Nate explains to you in detail how you could approach that. I would say watch the video. I'm not going to regurgitate it here, of course. And one thing that a lot of starting games masters, but also really experienced games masters, tend to struggle with is, okay, cool, I'm going to run the game. I kind of know the rules. I have the dice. I have the cool game master screen or DM screen. I've got some friends. They've got some characters. Now what? There should be some kind of story, and it should be really cool. One thing you can do, of course, is use existing material. You can use existing campaign settings. A lot of games have those to support their rules, mechanics, etc. You can use existing adventure modules or even entire campaigns that can run for even sometimes more than a year if you're really keen. But you can also come up with your own stuff. And I think a lot of it is going to depend on your group, on the characters that they want to play, and the kind of story that they want to play. So an important part of it is talking to your group and saying, hey, what would you like to do? What would you like to experience? What would your characters like to do or want to do? And another big part is understanding that stories, just like a lot of other things, have a certain structure. And once you understand the structure of a good story, then it becomes kind of like just filling in the blanks, connecting the dots. There are a lot of different approaches to getting this done. My guest of today will talk a little bit about the fact that he tends to prepare just one session at a time because his players have a lot of freedom and they can control a lot of the narrative, which means that if he prepares too much ahead of the time, well, then he's going to get stuck, or he's going to have to push them down a path that they don't want to go down, something known as railroading. Another approach would be to create an overarching story. And a wonderful resource for learning how to structure such a story really well and to be able to do it again and again in a consistent way is a YouTube channel called Great Game Master, or How to Be a Great Game Master. And the YouTuber who created it, Guy, he has a lot of experience and knowledge with the creation of stories. And what he does is he has a whole series called Building Your Campaign. Make sure you look it up on YouTube if you're curious. He explains quite a lot of, in huge detail, how every little step along the way could be done. And he also has a couple of videos outside of that series that just explain the basic structure that stories tend to follow. And if you want to go really in depth in your research about how stories or great, really epic stories work, I would advise you to read a book by Joseph Campbell called The Hero with 1,000 Faces, in which he describes in great detail how heroic stories or the hero's journey works. It's quite an interesting book, and any kind of person who wants to create a story that follows this type of narrative would do well to read this once or twice. Now, if you want to get into tabletop role-playing games, and let's say you haven't got a group yet, and you want to get a little bit of experience with this type of activity before you introduce your friends to it or before you start running games yourself, one wonderful resource that I've found over the years is on Facebook. Actually, it's a group. They call themselves the Tabletop RPG One Shot Group. You can find them pretty easily, and if not, there's a link. Yes, in the show notes. They're a really great group who organize and play lots and lots of one-shot adventures, which means, if you're not familiar with the term, literally a role-playing game where you play one session with a particular character and that is it, rather than getting invested in a very long campaign with people that you don't know, etc. This can be a nice low threshold to actually start playing these games, or if you're more experienced but you want to branch out to different types of games, or you want to experience playing with different people, a great way to do that without having a very high bar to entry. Okay, now I've given lots of different resources. I think I've also been talking for quite a while, I realize, so I think it is time that we move on to the next segment, which is the interview. So, everybody, as I said at the intro, we have a guest, and it is my honor actually to introduce Hankerin Ferinale, also known as Runehammer. He is the creator of Index Card RPG. He has a huge YouTube channel called Runehammer, where you can learn pretty much anything you want about role-playing games. And he's fostering something he calls the RPG Underground, which I'm very curious about.
Yeah.
Yeah, so welcome on the show, Hankerin.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. It's good to be here.
Yeah, great. So let's get started with a question. I'm very curious. So I sent you an email a while back, interviewing you. Asking you, hey, would you be on my show? And I wrote, the whole title of the podcast is RPG Heroes. So I want to interview people that I would consider a hero when it comes to role playing games. Yeah, when you saw that, what went through your mind?
Well, at first I was just like, well, a hero gets chucked around so much in RPG land.
Yeah.
I was like, no, there's no idea he's talking about me here. He must be in a new character he rolled up or something. So then I'm reading further and I was just like, oh, sweet, like more podcasts. I love it.
Yeah.
So especially it's really fun to do interviews and stuff because a lot of times just like effervescing material is nowhere near as fun as sort of being pecked at by someone new. So
Yeah.
it's always exciting to do it more one-on-one rather than just be like this kind of professorial kind of mode I can get in sometimes. It gets a little weird. Like, I feel like you're just yelling at the world sometimes. So just to talk to another person is much more fun.
All right, wonderful. And so now, so the idea of you being my personal hero when it comes to role playing games, yeah. How does have you ever been called a hero in your life?
I don't think so. I think
Really?
there was maybe some sort of sentimental stuff getting thrown around when I got in my big motorcycle accident,
Oh
and I
yeah.
kind of like I pulled out of it and like I built a bike and rode across the country to kind of show everybody that I wasn't like down and out. And
Yeah.
maybe that word got tossed around a little bit by some
All
of the
right.
people in like the motorcycle community.
Uh-huh.
So that it's nice and everything, but
Yeah.
honestly, it's a strange feeling to be like. It's easy to be heroic,
Uh-huh.
but it's difficult to be called something like a hero with like a capital H.
Ah.
That's pretty weird. I gotta say, that's a strange feeling.
All right. What defines a hero in your mind? Like what makes a hero a hero?
I mean, for me, it's someone who sort of embodies the best parts of that I have inside myself. So if I see
Mhm.
it in someone else and they seem to be exhibiting it in greater magnitude
Uh-huh.
than my parts, or maybe my parts are mixed in with others, then I consider them, oh man, they're like an avatar
Ah.
of what it is I'm wanting to be.
Uh-huh.
But almost in every case, I think, and I think this is the beauty of sort of hero and heroification, is that when you get to know those people, they're just as complex as you are.
Yeah.
And it was just the outward facing piece that represented that kind of, you're like everything I want to be. And then you get to know them and you're like, oh, you haven't like paid your rent this month, and like, you don't know where
Yeah.
your trousers are this morning. Like
Yeah.
really normal stuff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I see
So
what
I
you
think
mean.
I
Yeah.
think for me, like a hero is someone that it's what I kind of want to be, and at first I think it's all completely encapsulated in another person.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you use that. You're like, I'm going to be like that. Like I'm going to go that direction.
Exactly.
Um, I don't know. Is that what you were thinking? Like, what's your answer? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, so well, to me, the whole reason for starting this podcast was, I've been playing role playing games for the last 25-ish years, and
Hmm.
I've always looked at people who are able to create a whole role playing game and a community around it as it's something that felt to me unattainable but very interesting.
Mm.
Um, and I like speaking to audiences. I'm a teacher normally, um, but you speak to an audience of, I don't know, how many people look at your channel roughly?
It's right around 40,000 now.
Wow, yeah. So 40,000. I've never spoken to 40,000 people all at once,
It's
but
weird. I'll tell you what.
yeah. But here's hoping, yeah. But so when I look at what the reason I would consider you to be a hero is you're not just creating some kind of product and making money. Because when I first discovered you, if that's the right word, I watched videos that you created on YouTube, and I felt like, wow, this guy, he's got great ideas. He's sharing them for free, and helping people make this hobby much more approachable, much more attainable. Um, and I think it's great that you do this with this selfless kind of passion. And of course, I mean, yes, now there's a product, and that's selling really well on Drive Through RPG. But I get the feeling that's not the point, kind of.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't when I was, especially if you want to talk about like my video persona.
Mm,
I had no concept of publishing or honestly even making revenue. It really
no,
was not on my mind. I was
no,
just freaking out with enthusiasm
yeah, yeah,
because my own hobby had kicked up a sudden click. Like it had,
yeah,
I'm just like you. I've been doing it for years, but every once in a while you do have a sort of a breakthrough to a different realm of like fun.
yeah,
And I had just gone through one of those. So all I wanted to do was just like wave my arms. And
yeah,
then after waving my arms for, more than a year, then it started occurring to me like maybe I could kind of get into this, like, sink my teeth into it rather than just being like, wee, But in the beginning, really, that's all it was. It was just me saying we to the world. I really
yeah,
wasn't even taking an instructional point of view in my mind,
uh-huh.
even though I kind of had some jokes about, playing like a badass and stuff.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
never saw my channel as like a how to at all. I was just more
no,
like having a good time with it and just kind of going off and like drinking on Wednesday night and
yeah,
like, I got
yeah,
my new minis, you know what I mean?
yeah,
Yay, throw them in the air. It's kind
yeah.
of it's kind of what drove that whole beginning part of my YouTube channel.
Yeah, I can imagine because I mean, the first few videos I saw, it was also called Drunkens and Dragons.
Yeah,
And it
yeah.
was all a bit wild and odd. And I remember the first few seconds, I was like, can I learn something from this guy? But yeah, quite a lot actually. Yeah, and I've been using it also. So that to me that's a wonderful thing.
Awesome.
So you starting that channel is a nice kind of segue into the main thrust of this first episode, which is
Hmm.
starting new things, which could be anything: a new campaign, a new character, starting out as a game master. Um, yeah. So let's start off with you. So how did you get started in role playing?
Whew. Well, it was about 86, I guess.
Hmm.
And Some of the bigger kids. So in '86, I was like 12 years
Okay.
old or so,
Mhm.
and some of the bigger kids were already into D&D, and I had heard about D&D, but I can't really be a faker. I really didn't know anything about D&D when I sort of got started. I saw some of the books, like maybe at the bookstore,
Uh-huh.
or maybe even like in like J.C. Penney,
Right.
but I was just like, I didn't get it. I just maybe I was too young. I'm not sure. And so I was more into comic books.
Okay.
And at that age, I was like, I had discovered subscription comic books. So I would get a box like each month of
Okay.
like all the latest X-Men and Spider-Man. And that's where I kind of got into like my sort of reading habit, as an avid reader. And then I think that just sort of naturally led me to be curious about these other books I had seen. And hobby stores back in those days were like very Raul Partha oriented. There was a lot of metal mini kind of stuff, and I
Mhm.
just didn't really get it. And so for me, it really all began when the comic book world pushed me or crossed over into RPG world, and that took the form of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Ah.
So I was really into the OG TMNT books with the old black and white inked ones,
Uh-huh.
and Usagi Yojimbo. And I was like, that was very alternative in my day. Like the world hadn't discovered TMNT at all.
No.
And that led me to the TMNT RPG. And a friend of mine said, hey, you should check out, like, there's this bunch of stuff by this company called Palladium and everything. And I'm like, what is all this? This is crazy. Like I roll to attack and stuff. And then that is when I discovered Rifts.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And between TMNT, like Turtles in Time, where they go back to dinosaur times, and Rifts, for some reason, that made my brain finally click on what an RPG was.
Ah.
It just made perfect sense to me. I know that's a really weird genre to start in, but that's where I got started. And we were kind of into like cyberpunky stuff because I mean it's the
Uh-huh.
middle of the '80s, right? Like
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
we're kind of so
Mhm.
our very first time we sat down as kids together was probably seventh grade, and we played like this sort of RoboCop world that was like rifts and with mutant animals, like anthropomorphic animals.
Right.
and
Wow.
and that was our first game, and it was called Living Weapon, and it was completely homebrew because we just didn't get it. We didn't have the attention span to play a given system. So we just invented our own system. It was like a D6 dice pool type system, kind
Okay.
of like what later Shadowrun would be.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, it had like the parry rules from from TMNT. If you can believe that, that's so weird. We thought blocking was so cool. I have no
Yeah.
idea why. And that's how we got started. So we had a
Yeah.
5-person group, and we played these like cyborgs, and then the cyborgs led us to GURPS
Yeah.
and led us to Fantasy Hero. And then I had my first real DM early in high school, and he was brilliant. He was a kid who had graduated, so he's like 3 years older than us,
Right.
and he was just genius at this stuff. And that's when I saw the true landscape of what like a campaign could be, and like I got my hegemocation, and then
Yeah.
only after all that I finally discovered D&D.
Oh, wow.
So after 9 years or so of playing RPGs, I kind of stumbled into actual D&D.
Okay. And so you said that was the first actual dungeon master or game master that you came across.
Yeah, Dave. Yeah.
Huh. So in all these previous games, who was running? How did that work?
Me. It
You,
was
right?
me, and
Okay.
I was just sort of clueless, but I was always a storyteller.
Uh-huh.
So as far as being a GM, I had no idea what I was doing, and we would just GM as a group.
Right.
Like the group is the GM, but
Yeah.
I was also always the holder of what the hooks were and what the surprising
Uh-huh.
hidden facts were. Like
Okay.
we used to call them revelations. So at the end of every session, we would everybody would shut up and I would do the revelations.
Right.
And
Okay.
and it was so chunky back then too. We wouldn't even really reveal story as we played, if that's even imaginable. It's almost like
Oh,
we would play a board game,
right.
and then at the end of the board game, there'd be a 10-minute session where I'd say, okay, it turns out that blah, blah, blah. And this guy is actually blah, blah, blah. And we would have these set of revelations.
Right.
And then everyone would think about that for the next game.
Right. Wow, that sounds wonderful. So actually,
So
when you
weird.
think about it, you started out being a role playing game creator from the get go.
Yeah, I homebrewed before I played proper. That's for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah,
when we
'cause
tried to play proper, we just went cross-eyed. We're like,
yeah.
I'm supposed to put my strength bonus over into this attack thing and then add another number, and like I'm already, I can't deal. So
Yeah.
right away we just made like a single stat system with no derivative math or
Yeah.
anything.
Uh-huh, yeah.
So we're really just always stacking d6s and rolling them. That's
Okay.
all we were doing in the beginning. And we
Wow.
would come up with all kinds of stupid explanations for why we should get one more dice,
Yeah, yeah.
to beat the 14 target or whatever. I think
Yeah.
14 was kind of a magic number for us back then. So you want
Okay.
to be rolling like 4d6
Yeah.
all the time. And then
Yeah,
if
yeah.
you're rolling like 66, you're a baller.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
like that was the foundation of our system.
That's so cool. And do you have that written down somewhere? Like, is that something that people would
That
have access
notebook
to?
is long gone. All I have is
Yeah.
a photo, which has been somewhat famous on Facebook of it's me like when I'm about 14 and I have like a huge blonde afro.
Yeah.
And we're, we're playing and my notebook says living weapon. And I've got the notebook up like a DM screen, like all cool people do. And on the table, we have like a big mess and there's a bowl of popcorn and a pitcher of orange juice.
Oh, nice. Yeah. I'll see if I can
Living
find that.
large.
I'll see if I can find that so I can add it to the show notes. That'd be pretty good.
Yeah, it's like a really old, grainy photo, and it's like I'm really proud of that photo.
Wow.
Like,
That's cool. Um, yeah, and so whenever you start a new game, you need some kind of character, and I'm sure some of our listeners, just like me, especially in the beginning, have some trouble thinking, okay, how do I come up with a character concept, or
oof.
how do I start creating a character? How does that
Hmm.
work for you when you play in a game? Because I assume you still play rather than,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, I think this is another area where maybe I'm a little weird. Is that for me, and maybe this was just necessity out of being sort of boneheaded. But what we would do is we never got the memo on creating concepts and backstories. I think we like missed
yeah,
that was cool. We
uh,
just completely bypassed that. And so what we would do is we would sit down and we always started with the present tense.
right.
And so what we would do to get started is we would go around the table and you'd say one thing in the present.
Hmm.
So you'd be like, I will avenge my destroyed village.
All right.
That's like one of the most classic ones, right? Or
Yeah.
like, I'll kill all the orcs. They killed my dad.
Yeah.
This is like these are classic ones. But instead of saying my character is on an adventure because his village got destroyed and now he wants revenge, that's kind of talking about it like it's in the past.
Yeah.
Instead, we would always start with just speaking as ourselves in the present.
Right.
And then what we would do is, as we would play, just what would happen would get written down as if we had planned it, like our backstory.
Oh, okay. So it's
So
like retroactive kind of.
it's totally, we were just
Yeah.
like rampant retconners. And one of the things we would do was during play, somebody go like, well, I actually knew this guy years ago. And so he's probably going to cooperate with me. And like, as the GM, you're like narrowing your eyes a little bit, like, you just made that up, dude.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
never wrote down our backstories about this guy. And he's like, I know, but come play with me a little bit here. And you're like, okay,
Yeah.
fine. You know this guy. You knew this guy for 15 years. And that's how we would create backstory. We would create it in the fly of it. We would never, every once in a while, maybe we get a new player who'd come in and they'd have like this 4-page backstory and we make fun of them for months. Because we're mean bastards. But yeah, we always were all about the present. And so I think that made us more tight as a team too.
Yeah.
So rather than having 4 or 5 backstories, like is common in RPGs, and then you kind of find a way to fit them together or meet in the tavern, so to speak.
Yeah. I find
For
it
us, it
very
was more
difficult.
just like we've been together for 10 years and now we're going to set out into the desert. And you're saying that in the present to the guy sitting next to you.
Yeah.
And to me, that's just so much more feels like being a real person rather than, presenting this sort of piece of paper that describes what happened years ago.
Yeah.
So that's how we always started our character concepts.
That's a great idea. Yeah, because I find in my campaigns, so I have 2 separate groups that I play with, and the first group is very old. That's the people I used to play D&D with when I was a teenager, and it's
That's
great
awesome.
to be able to yeah, it's really cool to still be able to hang out with them and play the same games. But I find because we've all been playing so long, everybody has their own ideas about, oh yeah, I want to have this kind of character, or oh, some of
Hmm.
them are really great at coming up with very elaborate backstories.
Interesting.
But then to meld that into a group, a cohesive group, that's tough. Um,
Yeah, and I think you probably have you're cheating a little bit,
mm,
because if your friends are all old friends, they already care about each other.
yeah,
And that is the glue that makes every good campaign work, is that deep down, when someone's like really up the creek and needs help, they really care and want to help each other.
yeah,
And I think if you have that component, any group can work, even with the silliest character concepts, because they just freaking care.
yeah,
And they care in a real way, not like Mike, there's a note that says my character cares about you. Like,
yeah, yeah,
fuck that. That's boring to me. But
yeah,
what's exciting to me is when characters legit, like, will shed a tear for one another, and
yeah,
or like go way out of their way to help one another, not because it's like the cool RP thing,
no,
but because they honestly care about you and your fate. And to me, that is the guts of any good game. And then the GM is going to have an easy time.
yeah, yeah. Because then the
All he needs
stakes
to
are, it's easier to make the stakes high. Yeah,
The stakes are high, like right away, especially if somebody makes an error during play. They kind of,
hmm,
the classic one is they get too far from the group, right?
yeah, yeah,
And then they drop.
yeah,
And that moment to me is always, a lot of people separate RP and combat. And
hmm,
I've always found that the absolute best RP happens at that moment. Like when someone got too far from the group, they drop, and then they only have like 2 rounds to live. And the action
yeah,
economy is suddenly like exploded in everyone's face. Like,
yeah,
we have to move this far to even have a chance to save him.
yeah.
And like all the tactics suddenly become real. And so I think that care is like the root of all good character concepts and group concepts.
Totally agree. Yeah, and just last 2 days ago, I was talking to one of the guys from that group, and he said there's not a lot of games out there that foster that attitude. There's a lot
Mm,
about creating character mechanically, so hit points, blah blah blah. Some games talk about background. Cyberpunk 2020 is wonderful with that. They have this life path generator. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool about your one particular personal character. Another one that goes quite in depth is Riddle of Steel. Have you ever played that?
No, that's new to me.
That's a really really cool game. Um, for two things. One is the only way you get XP in that game is if you pursue the things that matter to you. So killing monsters, meh, doesn't matter.
Hmm,
Loot, nope. Unless loot is the one thing you have a passion for, and you have to actually
right, right.
write all that down. Um,
Cool.
but again, it focuses on the individual. And so when we played Riddle of Steel, they had to create these individual goals, which is great, and it really works fantastically for the game master to create hooks and things in the story based on those things. But they never really became a team because they, well,
Right,
my character's passion is this, so why would I help the other guy?
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean,
So
I've found the number one thing in a, like, systemically speaking, like
mm,
the way that the game itself can foster like teamwork and role play
uh-huh.
is very, very low amounts of hit points. It's
Yeah.
just that brutally simple. It's like, if people are fragile and they fear the world,
Hmm.
they will get to love each other. Like, they will be forced to, by the most fundamental tool I have as a GM, which is basically kicking you in the nuts.
Hmm.
So if I can kick my players in the nuts and get them down and get them on their heels again and again and again, they become friends.
Yeah.
Whereas I found that the tougher characters are, and I unfortunately I feel like Pathfinder has this problem a little bit.
Yeah.
If they become these kind of really tough, war machines, they don't need each other as much in a
Yeah.
practical way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
they aren't forced to become a team when they can just be like, I'm awesome over here.
Yeah.
So that was kind of what was behind like the 10 hit point system in ICRPG, which is
Yeah.
off. I think for a lot of players when they first play and they realize they're probably going to have 10 hit points for their entire lifetime as a character,
Yeah.
they kind of panic a little bit. Like, this kind of sucks.
Yeah.
And then you realize like even the worst enemies have like a 1d6 damage they're doing against you. So like everything gets so real so fast. It's just
Yeah.
0 to 60, and I found that's been really helpful to stitch teams together, even just in a single session.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree because I play a lot of different games because I'm curious about them. And recently you've been getting into Starfinder, which is a Pathfinder, well, from the
Mhm.
Pathfinder family. So lots and lots and lots of rules. But also the characters, like you say, they're extremely powerful and very durable. More even so than in D&D.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I find combat often it takes long. Can become a bit of a grind. Yeah. So when I started using Index Card RPG, I used it at first to introduce students of mine to role playing. So I had a little RPG club at the school.
Cool.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, but they were used to computer games in which usually you're quite powerful. So the first skeleton hits the first guy, he's almost dead, and they're like, "Whoa,
Yeah.
what's
Yeah, and
going
it's the
on?"
very first attack in the very first game, and you're
And it's
just like,
just a
"Oh
stupid
shit!"
skeleton. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So we had a lot of fun with that. Um, yeah. So eventually, I'm going to be starting some kind of new campaign. What advice would you have for me on starting a new campaign? Regardless what system I'm using. Yeah.
Well, it's a tough one to deal with my advice here, because
Mm,
on the one hand, I know that this piece of advice works great
yep.
on the practical level, but on the other hand, it does take away a lot of super fun hand wringing GM snickering in the darkness. And that advice is like never to plan more than a single session,
Mm,
never ever to go to break that holy law. So on the one hand, you do get a hyper adaptive and usually very detailed and mechanical session every time if you do this method.
mhm.
And so that's great. The players will have a blast. But it's somewhat cringy because only planning one session doesn't give you that sort of world creating fun that I think a lot of GMs like to do when they're coming up
Yeah.
with a new campaign. They like to make continents, and like make mountain ranges and all these different possible hooks and directions things could go, and
Yeah.
and and I don't think you quite get that feeling and that thrill by only preparing one session. So on quality of play and like really capturing player choice and making it matter for the direction of things, nothing beats the one session rule.
Right. Yeah.
But for the fun of just sitting down and creating this vastness, it can be a bit frustrating, even for me.
Mm,
And so my struggle has always been to find some kind of happy medium there. And that's where my recent efforts with my game called Birthday Boy
mhm.
um, have been sort of my best go yet at the method. I think it's like sort of coming up with a set of truths, not a set of gameplay,
Uh-huh.
and then those truths find their way into all kinds of details that really are driven by players. And so as far as creating a campaign, I almost feel like it's doing like a GM trust fall.
Right.
It's like you get your players to stand behind you and you're not looking, and
Uh-huh.
you're going to fall backwards into these mofos,
Yeah.
and you're trusting them to catch you.
Yeah.
But I think it's important, because I think if you don't have that trust and you say like, I am the creative overlord, I am the supreme source of truth in this world,
Mm,
I think that yes, that can be fun, but I don't think you're ever going to have that truly real feeling of players altering the world they live in. And that,
right.
that is the trust. That is the manifestation of a GM trusting players. Like,
Yeah.
it's not going to be my vision.
Mhm.
And I'm trusting you guys to give me cool stuff to work with and not to make fun of me because I'm a big weird dork with RPGs and I get really into it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so if you have that trust and then it's reciprocated, I feel like it's really magical. And
Yeah.
and that's when players are coming up with your campaign. And not
Okay.
just by wandering around the countryside. I don't mean
No.
that. I
No.
mean,
No.
they are literally saying like, usually players, they'll present this stuff by saying maybe.
Uh-huh.
Like maybe is a really powerful word for a player because they don't feel like they're walking on your creation as the GM. So they
Uh-huh.
say like, maybe, this villain is actually that old lady that we saw in town.
Yeah.
Like maybe like it was like shapeshifted into that old lady. You
Yeah.
as the GM never thought this. You never thought that the old lady was anything but a boring old lady. But then you're like, okay, yeah,
Yeah. Let's
that old
run with
lady
that.
totally was the elder vampire shapeshifted to fuck with you. Like, that is now the truth.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that is the coolest moment in our hobby when that kind of stuff can happen. As
Yeah.
far as your question goes, creating a campaign,
Yeah.
it's 10% GM. Basically, just you shove them out the door. And once they're out the door and they have a reason they really need to go out in the world,
Yeah.
they start creating the truth and what the next danger is going to be. And that's what you're doing session by session.
Yeah. 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 Oh, wow. Yeah, that sounds really great, because I tend to be one of those GMs who likes to write an overarching plot and then why and etc. And
Why?
why? Yeah, exactly. And then try to tie in all these characters into the story in the kinds of creative ways, and it takes a lot of time. And also it tends to take a lot of time for it to come up in the campaign.
Yes, it does. It's a very slow boil to see all that
Yeah.
work come to fruition. Yeah.
Yeah. Although, I find that fun as well. I mean, just tonight, or well, for you this afternoon, but for me
Right.
tonight, we were playing D&D, and yeah, so one of the characters discovered, like, whoops, I happen to be the heir of some powerful dragonborn house, um, or not dragonborn, dragon marked. Yeah, and it's cool because the player is like, wow, really? And then, oh, I have a brother, wow, and he's falling towards the lava. Oh my god.
Right.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think if the ideas come from the players, like you say, it can be more powerful, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, I love that effect too of the finding out you're the heir kind of thing. In my campaigns, I've always called it the tapestry.
Yeah.
And because so many of my games have had a moment where players come around a corner, there's a big ass tapestry on the wall, and it's pictures of them.
Yeah.
And I don't even know what the hell that's about. I don't even know why, if it's a prophecy, if they're like reincarnated or whatever the hell. I honestly don't care.
No.
All it is, it says like, it's this weird thing of like, and then you realize, like, you're the focus of the world or something. The tapestry could be almost anything.
Yeah.
But it's a great mechanism to be like, oh yeah, by the way, you're going to be king when the king dies. You just, you find that out by looking at this ring.
Yeah.
And then what else? How is that going to all play out? I have no idea. I just thought it'd be kind of a cool thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then if they can run with that ball of being so prophetic and being at the focus of story, it lets them be even more powerful with their maybe words, their maybe sentences. Well, maybe I, had to be hidden because they want to take down my family line. And so this is why I didn't know I was going to be king. And the GM's just going, okay, let me write that down really quickly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because if the GM is responsible for 100% of the story, what happens is they might use the word maybe, but they're more trying to second guess you, kind of.
Yeah, well, they're trying to see through to what they feel is back there.
Yeah.
Which is a real truth and a prepared truth, which can be really fun. It's like scratching away the dirt on a picture. Yeah. And they want to scratch that dirt away. They want to see the picture you made.
Yeah.
And I think somewhere between those two is where you get the most magical experience for the players. They discover something prepared, but they also have actively changed it with what they say.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. So when we speak about starting something new, when I heard you were starting to work on Altered State, I got quite excited because I mentioned Cyberpunk 2020. It's been a game in our group for well, I don't know, since the late 90s.
Yeah.
So, but we find Cyberpunk 2020 to it's retro, let's say, especially the technology, etc.
Yeah.
And ICRPG allows you to play all kinds of things. It comes with its own settings, etc., but not really cyberpunk yet.
Yeah.
So, how is Altered State different from Index Card RPG? Is it more like a source book for ICRPG, or is it its own thing?
I mean, it does assume a core comprehension of how the game works
Uh-huh.
from the main book. So in that regard, it is more like a source. You know, it is like a follow on.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't give you the absolute fundamentals like the core book does about using targets and how
Yeah.
the math is non-derivative and all this kind of stuff.
Okay.
So it is an extension in that regard. But how it's different, um, I mean, there are some rules foibles which are not terribly interesting to get into about dying, and we do have a thing called surge dice now for altered state, which definitely makes runners in our world much more augmented than someone in a fantasy world.
Okay.
But one of the big ones, and now that I've run about 4 sessions with it and played in about 8, um, the biggest and most exciting difference I think is probably quite simply just the guns. We
Right.
put almost like most of our work is just in our gun set, and
Mm-hmm.
it's 16 weapons. So there's a few. I think there's 4 non-guns in the 16 weapon set,
Okay.
which are like a razor whip and a katana and a nodachi and gyro knives, which are like
Nice.
throwing knives.
Yeah.
And so each in RCRPG core, all weapons are very intentionally just boiled into one thing. They're only different in the narrative elements of how they do what they do.
Yeah.
But in Altered State, the gun play it's so central that on the character sheet we actually have all 16 weapons listed with a bubble, so
Mm.
that as you gain and lose them, you just mark or erase your bubble. And then each one has its rules on the character sheet, so that as you gain or lose these weapons, you have your new rule right there. Because this is something I'm really happy with.
Uh-huh.
Every gun has its own sort of mechanic and rule, and they all function wildly differently. And
Okay.
they slag their barrels on a 1. So if you slag a gun just because you rolled a 1, you just throw it aside. And so then you're looking around the world to find another gun or another weapon of some kind. And that has created a really fun life cycle for characters. It's like you're constantly shifting what your loadout is.
Right.
And so
Okay.
you're constantly learning a new gun. You're like you pick up a Mac 12 and you're just like racking it, and you're like, how the hell does this thing even work?
Yeah.
And it's like looking down at your sheet and going, oh shit, this thing fired 20 rounds at a time. And like, wow, and then some of the bigger guns like actually have a capacity, and there's little tracking bubbles on the sheets. And that has just become so damn fun. And I would actually say I put more art time into the guns than I did the characters so far.
Okay.
So like it was, I don't know if you knew this, but I did gun art for the video game industry for years. I did hundreds upon hundreds of guns when I was a
Right.
concept artist. I just would paint guns for weeks on end as a job.
Wow.
And so when it came time to do Altered State, I knew I wanted to really express myself in these cyberpunk guns and like make you want them. And they're like kind of covetable, like they're kind
Yeah.
of collectible.
Uh-huh.
And that aspect has really, really become fun. So putting specific play mechanics on guns that are useful for some situations and horrible for others.
Right. Yeah.
And so like in our main group, we actually have a bin. We have like a shopping cart that we take around with us everywhere we go, and it just has like 25 guns in it because we're so paranoid about not having the right one or not having any.
Yeah.
And so we're like always on this like gun shopping trip.
Oh, amazing. That really reminds me of a character in one of my cyberpunk campaigns. He actually had a wheelie bin with him filled with weapons.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah. And in this world, that is not terribly strange. Like that
No,
makes
no.
sense. Yeah.
Okay. That's great. And what about you were talking about I think you were calling them deckers or runners.
Yeah. Deckers and runners. Yeah.
Yeah. So what about hacking or net running or whatever you want to call it? That's a big thing in
Yeah.
cyberpunk.
Always. Yeah. So we started from the fundamental point of view that like, Decker's goofing off in the virtual realm while everyone else is in the real world. It just sucks.
Yeah.
And we also took the stance that seeing the future in sort of this lawnmower man kind of virtual reality sense is actually very low tech.
Yeah.
In the 90s, that seemed maybe kind of neat. Like ooh, I'm flying through a 3-dimensional simulation space. It's just like, no. We take the stance that high tech is much more like the technology that maybe you see like in The Mandalorian, right? You see like a little fob with a green light on it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Like there aren't a bunch of screens and words and readouts and lengthy data. That's all very low tech to me.
Yeah.
To me, high tech gets out of your way and is almost invisible.
Mm-hmm.
And so we take the stance with decking that it's really just like being a sort of a wizard, and you're kind of improving what your spells are. So what you see the most is, I want to turn off the lights in this building. Like that's a classic Decker moment, right? Where I want to lock the doors. That's another classic Decker moment. So rather than putting you into some kind of flibbity jibbity doodad song and dance, it's just a roll. You just make the roll, you type it up on your thing, and like the green light blinks and the lights go off. You don't get all this 3D data and all this freaking scrolling text in your imagination. To me, that's just so low tech.
Yeah.
So we imagined a far higher tech world where almost there are no screens. Like you will get data via, like, we call it a retina console. So you get, direct, maybe visual data, but it's not like you're reading. Like reading just is so low tech. It's just so boring
and very slow.
So we have a very minimalized sense of how technology works. And that's how we play out our decking. So our decking is really a matter of describe it, roll it, and let's see if you can do it. And it's really just divided into offense and defense. So you need the gear to do offensive decking, but you don't need programs and time and, a little plug or something like it. It's all just, it's just so low tech. And so it's basically just like rolling perception almost. It's like really comes down to a single roll. Because that's how ICRPG likes to play. It's every turn you move a little bit, you make one roll, you say one cool thing, and you're done.
Next.
Next. Okay, great. The lights turn off. Next.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. And you mentioned surge dice. That's a new term for me. What?
So at beginning of every session, you just get 4d8, and you can blow them on anything. You can use them on anything involving numbers.
Right.
So you just have 4 chances to burn these. There's no way to regenerate them. You just get them at the beginning of the session. So they're like your own little teeny economy you can use.
Okay.
And they have really turned out to be great.
Yeah.
We really like them. And they're not tradable. So you can't give them to another player. So everybody has their own little tight economy. And you can put it on how many bullets go flying, how much you recover, how far you move. Like you can, it's just basically like we imagined a little blue and white capsule.
Yeah.
So when that time comes, you just pop it and you just run a little bit faster.
Cool.
Or you aim a little bit tighter because you're like wired out for just a few seconds.
Yeah. All right. Wow. Love it. And when is this coming out?
Well, the quick start has already come out on Patreon, which is $1 for everything.
Right.
And the quick start really has everything. It just doesn't have a lot of the flavor. So it doesn't have all the enemies and, NPCs and world locations and stuff. It's just the fundamentals to play. So the rest would be all DIY. But as far as it being done, I'm hoping for probably February or so.
Oh, that's
maybe March.
Cool.
Yeah.
Great. Well, if any of our listeners are excited about this, they'll know where to find you through the show notes. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. And that kind of that whole idea of modernity and hacking, that kind of brings me to another question I had kind of bumping around in my head, which is, as far as I can see on YouTube, you don't really stream your games, but you've shown bits and pieces. Do you do most of your playing online or face-to-face?
Right now I do, just because I live in a very teeny town, like up in the mountains. So I just don't, like the people that I did play with are kind of way down there in the city.
Right.
And, they don't want to drive for an hour and a half to come on up. You know what I mean? So yeah, mostly I've been playing online recently, but I'm freaking moving to Philadelphia.
Really?
So yeah, we're going to move to Philadelphia here pretty soon. And basically a big part of the thinking of that move is to just plunge right into a very large community of people
Yeah.
and get back to like going to cons and like physical play at the table.
Yeah.
Playing online is great,
Hmm.
but it does wear you down a little bit over the course of a few years. You know, you do get a little tired of looking at your computer.
Yeah.
I'm sure everybody has felt that before. Even for the best computer experiences, you do feel like you're in your room looking at your computer. It's just not a
Yeah.
great feeling.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we wanted to just go on an adventure and move.
Hmm.
But also really looking forward to being in the middle of like a big, vibrant player pool,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So now that it's starting to get out that I'm moving to Philly already, you know, people have been contacting me, be like, dude, I'm going to live right up the road. You should come play with our group.
Yeah.
So I think it'll be fun to just kind of be a bit of a couch surfer and play in groups and find a whole new landscape of players. I think that's going to be super crazy and wild.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. And yeah, because the thing is, I find I've moved around a lot. And then every time you move to a new place, yeah, it's like you say, you have to find people to play these games with that are fun, that are nice people to hang out with, not just roll dice.
Yeah.
Um, and for some people, it's hard to find local players, depending on where you live. Here in Holland, I have to say the hobby is doing okay. It's not bad, but yeah, driving 1.5 hours over here means I'm in a different country.
Yeah, totally. And you know, that's another thing we wanted to move for is like
Mm,
the West in the United States it's just gigantic. It's
yeah.
just so huge and empty,
Hmm.
which is cool. That is its appeal. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
beautiful. Um, but as far as like meeting people and sort of doing you know, things in a human community, you know, being in the West of the United States is like a tough place to do that. It's all just
yeah,
mountains.
yeah, 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 yeah. Wow. Yeah, over here, yeah, it just doesn't compare.
Right, right. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
All right. And what would you say is so as far as I can tell, your preference is playing at the table, right?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I like playing online. I've had a great time. I'll continue
yeah,
to do it probably forever.
yeah,
But it has taught me how much I like that kind of there's a silliness at the table,
yeah.
even in the treatment of the material itself or the treatment of what you're gathered around, be it a drawing or miniatures or whatever. There's
Hmm.
something silly there that the virtual tabletop can never be that silly.
Hmm.
It's a digital landscape that looks kind of cooler in some ways,
Yeah,
but
sometimes,
it's just never has that silly, you know, loose feeling of like, you know, okay, each one of these Skittles is a goblin.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
You know what I mean? Like that, those moments aren't necessarily what you dream of the hobby being. You know, you want to have goblin minis, but
yeah,
those moments to me are some of the ones you really remember that can really just make it fun and loose and bring it back to the friendship
yeah,
rather than the game presentation, you know?
yeah. Yeah, I have to say I agree with you. I found a lot of uses for online gaming, especially with the distance between me and my friends here and there. But yeah, like you say, you start to focus a lot on how is it presented? How do I make the
Yeah.
dynamic lighting work? Oh my god!
Yeah.
Uh,
And doing audio, like
yeah,
especially in my birthday boy games that I've been running recently, like audio is critical to the mood that I'm trying to create.
right.
And would be hard to do at the table in a way that is equally dramatic because you know you have everyone has headphones on.
Yeah.
So you can really get inside their head
Ah, yeah, yeah,
with very low level audio and you can bring it up in a way that can be deeply unnerving.
yeah, yeah,
And that could be very hard to do at the table with a little more jocularity, you know what I
yeah,
mean? Because it's a little sillier.
yeah.
So I think horror is a lot easier to do online
Mm,
because you can just get inside people's heads. And
yeah,
at the table, horror is never scary.
yeah,
It's always a little bit more funny, like Friday the 13th kind of horror. It's a little bit
yeah,
like who's gonna die next,
yeah.
you know. But online, it can be very like, am I hearing what I think I'm hearing? Like it's
Oh
starting to
yeah.
it's drilling a little hole in my mind like
Yeah.
you know, so some of the behavior I've seen in birthday boy has been really crazy of how you can feel the actual terror in the players
Wow, yeah.
where they're making like bad or drastic decisions because they're afraid.
Yeah.
and disturbed. They're like honestly disturbed by what they're encountering. And so they're like convulsing in a way. And like, that's when I'm just like, perfect.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, because I try to do this. Yeah, I've got this Bluetooth speaker on the table, and I've got my laptop behind the DM screen, all that stuff,
Mhm.
um, and just today there was a scene where some of the players were kind of isolated in a room, and some kind of ghost type creature approached, and I had this insane babbling sound, and yeah, exactly. And luckily, I didn't have to do that myself. um, but I played it on the Bluetooth speaker, and like you say, I think if it goes into your headphones and you're alone in some kind of room, probably low lights, and
Yeah.
have a different effect. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, very different. And I've never made anything as scary as these recent games that I've been running,
Uh-huh.
because I wanted to show my players like my vision of cyberpunk.
Yeah.
And it's just, I don't think it's anything that they have expected. I think
Hmm.
it's much more like horror,
Yeah.
in a world that's the sort of the husk of the hyper advanced world.
Hmm.
And to me, that is just such a right place for horror.
Yeah.
And then that's where this sort of birthday boy sort of entity kind of came into my imagination. And even I was just like, this is kind of fucked up. Like, this thing is creepy. Like, I'm starting to not like even making this stuff. And that effect has really transferred. So I've been really having a great time watching these players. Some of them have killed themselves just because it's getting in their heads. And like, this
Whoa.
is not something I told them to do. This is not
Yep.
something I
Yep.
led them on.
Yep.
They're just like, they're so terrified of it, like taking them over and
Uh-huh.
using them,
Yeah.
that they've shot themselves. I mean, it's just like
Wow.
that's a bit of a holy grail from a GM point of view, of like this much
Yeah.
drama
Mhm.
just coming out of their reaction to the material. They can easily just walk away from this stuff, but it
Yeah.
kind of gets in their heads.
Wow. Okay. That sounds great. All right. Well, so we talked a bit about starting new things, starting new characters, new
Mm.
campaigns. For any of our listeners who are thinking, well, it's 2020 by the time this comes out, new year, new me, and all that. I want to
Yeah.
start being a game master. I want to be as cool as these guys. Um, well, cool in inverted commas.
Yep, cool in quotes.
Um, what would you say is a good way to start off as a game master? Because you started off as a game master, you had no experience as a player.
Absolutely.
Boom, here we
Yeah.
go. What would you say to anybody who's aspiring to run a
Well,
game, to that game?
I think I'd give two options to put on the menu, and you can choose your option on the menu,
All right.
depending on your sort of personality.
Yeah.
And the first option is like Gandalf in the basement of Minas Tirith. So remember this scene where he has to go look up the history of the Ring of Power?
Yeah.
Remember that? And he's by himself. He says, there are questions that need answering. And he's like,
Yeah.
I got to go over to Minas Tirith and I got to do some homework. So this would be the first persona that I would invite people to become,
Hmm.
is like, get your mug and your pipe and down into the darkness and stack up your books and get that feeling of doing, of rubbing your hands and wringing your hands with sinister intentions.
Yeah.
And let yourself become that long before you worried about, I'm going to run a session and we got to figure out blah, 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 blue.
Yeah.
Before you get into any of that, let yourself enjoy what I think is still one of the most fun parts of being a GM, which is that feeling of devious, evil, sinister masterminding down in the darkness.
Yeah.
It's a really fun feeling. Whether or not it ever even reaches the table does not freaking matter.
No.
You're just enjoying the thought of being like, ooh, imagine if they blah, 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 or whoa, wouldn't it be crazy if this turned out to be this and then it all went to hell, or
Yeah.
whatever.
Mhm.
Whatever you're interested in, just dive deep and let yourself enjoy that phase.
Mhm.
Because if you do get a game going, you're not going to get as much time to do that as you would dream. So
No.
that's version one.
Uh-huh.
Version one is be like that Gandalf who's like researching down in the depths to candlelight. Like, let yourself have fun with that.
Yeah.
The other version that I would want to provide is sort of, let's just stay in the Lord of the Rings realm.
Hmm.
It would be much more like being Frodo. So Frodo doesn't plan shit. Like Frodo just lives in the moment, man. He's like, he's good to go. He's pure Zen. And Frodo is also like the sort of the beacon of friendship, right? Like that's Frodo's power is people meet this guy and they just want to be his friend. So if you're like that, then I would take the opposite approach. I would start by finding your group before you know anything about anything.
Mm-hmm.
You're just like, oh, I know the homies that can throw down on this stuff, like who are already into other weird things. Like, you know, my one buddy's into Marvel, and then I got some Star Wars friends, and they're all sort of getting excited. They're hearing about D&D, or maybe a couple of them have played. And then you just put those fingers out. And you say, you guys, I want you to come over to my house like Friday night. I got like a case of beer, and we're just going to shoot the shit. Maybe we want to try doing D&D. And this is such a different psychological profile than the Gandalf character.
Yeah.
This is just somebody who's just like, hey, man, I don't know what I'm doing. I really don't even have any plans or dreams or ambitions. I just want to hang out with you weirdos, and let's just see what happens. And maybe like, you know, maybe Chuck's going to be the GM. I don't know.
Yeah.
And just go with that. And when that group comes together, they'll create the magic. And maybe since you're the host, you'll be the natural option to be the GM, you know, or maybe someone else will be the GM. But I don't know about you, but sometimes the GM is not really the leader. Sometimes in a group, the leader is the person who like hosts, who has it at their house.
Yeah.
And they're kind of also like the alpha player, and the GM is almost in service to that leader. And that's okay too.
Yeah.
But again, it's like playing on that Frodo-like property that some people definitely have, of being like, when they raise their hand and say, come over, people want to go over to their house.
Yeah.
And if you have that property, you're going to be a fantastic game master.
Yeah. All right. So basically there are two approaches, and neither of them, as far as I can hear, focuses in any kind of way on mastering a system or all that kind of stuff.
No, not at all. Who cares?
Yeah.
No system matters, and minis and all that other stuff don't freaking matter. It's all just whoop-de-doo.
Yeah.
You know, and it's just like, go read Burning Wheel and you'll realize how a brilliant game can be one that you don't necessarily ever want to play it as it's written. But it doesn't matter. It just because it's wonderful, and it makes you want to get to the table. It makes you want to dream and fantasize and get crazy. And that's the essence of what we do. Not like, you know, which feats do I get? It's like, who cares?
Exactly.
Make two up. Like,
Yeah, in that sense, I can be very frustrating for some of my players, because one or two of my players are, let's say, very technical minded, so they enjoy the mechanics of the game. And you know, with games like Starfinder, there's a lot to delve into. You know, and I kind of usually just play it by ear. Like, well, I guess this happens.
And I think it's easy to accommodate those players.
Yeah,
because they tend to be very prepared and like mentally equipped to play.
Yeah,
I think that's the easier player to work with, even though they might have like too much detail.
Yeah,
it's the player who isn't sure they even want to do this. Behavior of sitting together. That to me is the most challenging player to get excited. You know, I'd rather have too much interest in rules and details than not enough. You know, because then you're kind of like waving your arms, trying to be like, this is fun, trust me, it's really fun. And they're kind of like, I don't know, it's all right, I'd rather be watching TV. That can be difficult to work with.
Yeah. But I guess for those people, it can also be a conclusion. Okay, I'm not going to be doing this.
Right. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. If you don't like it, why would you do it?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so I think we have a lot of stuff covered now for this particular episode, and there's one question I want to ask each and every one of my guests, which is very simply: do you have any heroes when it comes to role-playing games? Who are the people that you look up to, or that you looked up to when you were, you know, figuring out all this role-play stuff?
Well, I guess I probably have two of them.
Okay.
First of all, it wouldn't necessarily be because of his creations per se, or his career or achievements.
No.
But more because I knew him on a personal level when he was doing some of what I think is his coolest work, and that's Keith Baker.
Okay.
And so Keith, this may not be very widely known, but in the 90s, he was in the video game industry with me.
Right.
And that is when he was still a very prolific writer and RPG player.
Mm.
And, was really gracious to bring me over to his house where he has all his cow collection. And this guy's wacky.
Yeah.
But at that time is when he wrote the first Eberron book and
Really?
submitted it just for a contest that D&D was having, and he won the contest. And that is how Eberron was born.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't consider him a hero necessarily just because of his towering achievements.
Mm.
It's just as a person, I knew him as a person back then.
Yeah.
And I knew that he was really just kind of had I'm just another guy, kind of a tone. And I really respect that in people. Even when they're achieving big, they're just more about longevity, and they're just more about showing up and just sort of doing the daily activity of writing, which for him, I was really in awe of his ability to just show up each day and just lay down words. And some of them are great, some of them suck, but it's more just that, it's in my head and I'm going to do my practice, which is sitting here and just belting it out. And we were working on a big mud at the time, if you can believe that. Boy, muds are just like so far in the past.
Yeah.
But in a way, he was a sort of, as far as RPGs goes, he was heroic to me because Eberron to me was really fascinating when that first book came out, and was a huge influence on my novels, especially the concept of the black pools was to me such an inspiring concept. It's where my novels begin.
Yeah.
And so in that way, he was sort of creatively heroic to me.
Huh.
The other one, and I don't know this is almost the opposite. I don't know this person in any way, shape, or form. Never met them.
Right.
Never even made eye contact with this person. And this is Luke Crane. Okay. And Luke Crane is the creator of The Burning Wheel and sort of Mouse Guard and Torchbearer indirectly. And especially pursuant to Burning Wheel, I think Luke Crane has a bit of like a feeling of courage almost, of sort of bravery to go outside what you're going to expect.
Yeah.
And then not just go outside what you're going to expect, but follow it up with like some, like really finding the right people then to work with, like with artists and doing layout and font choice. And all these things really, really matter when it comes to how quality something feels. And I don't sit around playing Luke Crane games, but everything that he's made that I've stumbled upon has just sort of really like illuminated me, like has just made me go like, wow, just like, where was your mind when you were just wandering out into this new territory? And I think really Mouse Guard shows that in spades. Not only does it take like an amazing artist who had already created one of the most innovative worlds that I know of, but then backed it up with really brave design. And then the materials they produce are just a joy to like put your hands on. So I don't know anything about Luke Crane personally. Could be a totally mean dude. I have no idea. But this is the opposite. It's his creations are sort of creatively heroic to me in that they really do have a sincerity to them. And you could call out, I think, a lot of publishers that don't have this, where they're making materials for you. There's a new book that you can get for your system and stuff, but there's a feeling of the sincerity isn't there. It's more like they needed a product and they made one and they delivered it to you. And that it's a subtle and nuanced kind of feeling. But when that sincerity isn't there, it really is kind of painful. It almost is like like Alex Alvarez described his relationship with WotC like an abusive relationship. He keeps buying the stuff and then kind of shaking his head and not really using it, but he keeps coming back and buying it.
Yeah.
And to me, Luke Crane and his creations have been the exact opposite. Like Burning Wheel is really what got me back into actively being a hobbyist in must have been about 2010 or so.
Right. Okay.
And I had been on a break. I'd just been focusing on video games and being a concept artist. I discovered Burning Wheel, and that just, I was like, my God, RPGs have totally evolved since, in the past 4 years since I've kind of been taking a break. This is insane. And then I found myself on a YouTube channel.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
So I'm ashamed to say I know nothing about Burning Wheel. What if you could say it in a sentence, what makes that special? What makes that different from other games?
Well, I mean, it's dice mechanic is the scoundrels and heroes kind of system. So it's binary,
Right.
which is how Mouse Guard also works.
Uh-huh.
But I think it's really the whole thing is in the details.
Hmm.
It's an RPG like many others with character creation and with here's how the obstacles work and here's how you here's some weapons and
Yeah, yeah.
but like the feel and the touch of it and the tone and the detail and the voice that he has
Mm-hmm.
are just brilliant to me, and I actually thought Forbidden Lands had a little bit of this by Free League, and almost Simba Room to some extent
Ah,
has some of this magic.
yeah.
It's not like it's world shattering. It's still like a forest.
Mm-hmm.
You got swords.
Yeah,
You're going to go in there and stab the stuff you find.
yeah,
But
yeah.
the voice that it takes and the tone just makes you want to get in, and like it makes you excited, and it feels sincere, and it feels like crafted.
Okay.
And I think Burning Wheel has that.
Well, I'm going to check it out after this.
Oh,
That is for
absolutely. You
sure.
got to get the Burning Wheel Gold Edition. You
Uh-huh.
absolutely have to have that book on your shelf.
All right. I will definitely check that out and put a link in the show notes to it, of course.
Cool.
Yeah, and the other one, Keith Baker, actually is on my list of people I want to invite because the campaign I've been playing for the last 1.5 years is an Eberron campaign.
Oh, great. Yeah, he's a
Yeah,
wonderful weirdo.
and I saw that now Eberron also came out for 5th edition because we're still playing 3.5.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, exciting. I hope I can get in touch with him. That'd be wonderful.
Yeah, good idea.
Yeah. So all I can say, really, Hankerin, is thank you so much for doing this. You're the first guest on my very first episode of this podcast,
Yeah.
and I think we're off to a great start with this interview.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Is there anything else you want to say in closing, or shall we just leave it at this?
No, I'd like to reinforce your concept of new year, new me for 2020. I know
Yeah.
it's cheesy.
Yep.
I know it's every damn year, but I don't care. It's
Yep.
still cool to think like 2020 feels like has a cool feel to it, right? I mean, that's a
Yeah.
cool looking year when you write it down.
Yeah.
So I invite everybody out there to like reattack,
Yeah.
like bring your energy back to 2020 and be cool.
Exactly. Cool. Well, wonderful closing words. Thank you so much, Hankerin, and I hope to speak to you again sometime on episode 100 or something.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great.
All right. Thank you very much. All right. That was the very first interview with our first RPG hero. And wow, I have the feeling that I have learned a lot from Mr. Runehammer himself, Hankerin Ferinale. And I think one interesting thing that I've learned from him, which I think relates very much to this podcast, is that he's a hero, but he's also a very normal person. And his stories are very relatable, if you ask me. And this means that the point of this whole podcast is for me to meet all these people that I've put on a pedestal as heroes in the RPG world and realize that they are people like you and me. And that means that you and I can also become RPG heroes. We can also create some kind of meaningful contribution to the game, to the hobby, and to RPGs in general, which is great. I loved his take on the different ways that you could start becoming a games master, where one is the Gandalf who sits in his basement reading Elder Scrolls and every now and then kind of cackling at himself. Oh, yes, 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 this is it. And kind of closet yourself away and get inspired by all these things that you can read. And the other one being Frodo, who kind of lives in the moment and says, hey, let's just do this and we'll figure out what happens next, and be open to all the input from your players and see what happens. I think that's just wonderful information that we have gleaned from Hankerin. So the one last thing that I promised you at the start of the episode is a competition, and here we go. So what can you win, first of all? You can win the hardcover book of Index Card RPG Core 2nd edition. Isn't that wonderful? Now, what do you need to do to win this? Well, first of all, you need to like and follow my Facebook page at facebook.com/RPG Heroes Podcast. Step 2, take a photo in which you measure distance on a battle map with a banana. Try to create a really evocative scene. Why a banana, you might think? Well, the core rules of Index Card RPG suggest that if you want, you could measure distance on the map with a banana to roughly see the difference between near and far. I thought it was a really funny concept, and it's kind of liberating that you don't have to walk around in 5-foot squares like some other games do. Right, so like I said, try to create a really cool scene with some miniatures, etc. if you have them, or with some cut-out paper minis if you want to create those. Step 3 is share your photo on my Facebook page with the hashtag RPG Heroes Podcast. Step 4, make sure you get as many likes and other reactions as you possibly can by spamming all your friends and asking them to do so. Step 5 is really, let's wait and see, because the photo with the highest number of likes and other reactions on the 31st of January, around about 10 p.m. my time, will win. Very simple. And I will contact the winner via Facebook message for their physical address so I can get the book sent out to them ASAP. Good luck, everyone. Well, that's a wrap for the first of many episodes. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed recording. If you did, please consider leaving a review on iTunes. It really helps to get the podcast get heard. Want to keep up with the latest news about my podcast? Then hop on over to my Facebook page on facebook.com/RPG Heroes Podcast. Check out my website at rpgheroes.buzzsprout.com and engage with the other listeners and me. Links are in the show notes, of course. Want to support the show and join other supporters on my Discord channel? Then I would be honored if you check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/RPG Heroes. Until next time, stay heroic.